Big Shaq had always been a man of few words and even fewer public appearances. At 52, he had established an empire founded on accurate discretion and merciless efficiency. Although his name was well known in the jewelry industry's highest levels, the man himself was a shadow behind the glitzy exteriors of his upscale stores. He was the company's supreme boss, but nobody really knew him. Shaq was the one pulling the strings. He had planned every transaction, acquisition, and expansion, and no one, not even his closest advisors, had ever seen his face. For some, it was a privilege and a curse. For others, it was a myth. For Shaq, he was a living legend. He was just a businessman going about his business without fanfare. His office, a penthouse perched high above the city, was a reflection of his personality. It was sleek, minimalist, and incredibly private. His office was filled with the soft glow of his monitor screens, casting an almost eerie light on his face. The financial report was open before him, and as he flicked through it, the numbers seemed to blur into one cohesive whole until he reached the final page, at which point he noticed a discrepancy. At first glance, it was a slight gap between what the branch had reported and what the central system was showing. But Shaq knew better than to dismiss such details. The view was breathtaking, with the city's lights flickering below like the stars he had once dreamed of reaching. He read the data once again, this time with more focus, for he had built this empire on accuracy, and nothing escaped his examination. The sum in issue wasn't simply a little error, however. It was too big to be dismissed as such. Someone was concealing something significant since the statistics didn't match up. Shaq leaned forward and ran his fingers over his chin reflectively. The amount was significant enough that it may be the consequence of either egregious neglect or theft, but he couldn't afford to speculate. He needed clarifications. His thoughts instantly went to the only person who could be in charge of such a thing. Linda Hay, the downtown jewelry branch's deputy director. Linda had been employed by the firm for 5 years. On the surface, she was a productive, astute, and apparently reliable team player who rose up the ranks fast, winning the respect of both management and employees. However, Shaq had been hearing stories about Linda. Shaq wasn't one to act on rumors, but this report revealed whispers in the halls, inexplicable gaps in her transactions, and little, unnoticeable signals that, when combined, presented a disturbing picture. His concerns had been confirmed by this irregularity in the financials. Although Shaq had a great deal of trust in Linda's branch, which had been in charge of some of the company's most valuable assets, such as rare, inexpensive gemstones, he had a sneaking suspicion that she wasn't as loyal as she seemed. He needed to know the truth, but he couldn't do it through traditional means. Shaq was a guy who worked in the background, never revealing his hand. To approach Linda directly would mean revealing who he was, and he was unwilling to take the chance. Instead, he would need to look into her without her knowing he was going undercover. Shaq spent the next 4 hours coming up with a scheme in which he would pose as a rich buyer who enjoys unusual jewels and a frequent client. The strategy was simple, but it needed precision. And Linda, in her conceit, would never have guessed that the guy in front of her was the one whose company she had been stealing. When Shaq knew Linda would be working alone, he picked a time to go into the store, ask her questions about different jewelry, and watch how she behaved. If she was guilty, he would make sure of it by making sure she gave herself away, and once he had the evidence, he would deal with her quickly, fairly, and without hesitation. The following morning, Shaq left his penthouse with the assurance of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. His driver drove him to the downtown jewelry store. He was dressed modestly, wearing a dark suit that was a little outdated but still exuded wealth. His eyes were shielded by dark sunglasses, and his hair was left loose enough to blend in with the crowd. Shaq's proposal would unold old Linda's shop, situated on a bustling boulevard. The shop was surrounded by tall buildings and upmarket stores. Inside, the opulent setting included dazzling displays of diamonds, emeralds, and sapphires, and the air was filled with the aroma of pricey fragrances and the background hum of gentle music. As Shaq entered, he timed his steps and looked around. The space as anticipated, Linda was behind the counter. She was tall, in her late 30s, with sharp features, and she welcomed Shaq with a grin and a confident stance. Her gaze swiftly swept over him before settling on the jewelry before her. Shaq's heart rate stayed constant. He was composed and in control of this transaction, which was just another day at work, but this time the stakes were higher than anything he had ever encountered. "How may I be of assistance to you today, sir?" Linda has a sophisticated, silky voice. Shaq detected a faint hint of fear in her voice, but it was hardly detectable. "I'm searching for something uncommon. Something special," Shaq murmured, his voice calm, a little grin on his lips. As they went around the shop, Shaq posed questions, intended to determine her level of jewelry expertise as well as to observe her emotions. Linda's eyes glittered, and for a brief time, he saw the avarice flash in them. Perhaps too professional, Linda's responses flowed naturally, but Shaq knew better than to believe appearances because of the way she handled the diamonds, and the way her fingers lingered on some of them for an extended period of time. Shaw had been told that this was one of the sets Linda had been tampering with, but he needed to make sure for himself. "That's a beautiful set," he said, leaning closer. "How much would something like this cost?" The topic of conversation shifted to a set of rare rubies that were part of a collection the company had recently acquired. Before he could push her further, Linda's expression darkened and her eyes narrowed. "That's all you came here for?" she said sneeringly, her tone abruptly changing. "Do you think you can just waltz in here and buy everything with your dirty money? You're just like the rest of them, thinking you can buy anything you want." Shaq blinked, surprised by the venom in her words. He had expected arrogance, perhaps a slight deflection, but this was something very different. "Don't act like you're some big shot," Shaq said, maintaining his composure even though within the gears were churning. Linda came in closer, her eyes sparking with something deeper. "You think I don't know who you are? That I don't know what you've been doing to this firm? That you can come in here and threaten me like everyone else? But I've got news for you, Shaq." She spit her words with such contempt. Even though Shaq's pulse was racing, he maintained a neutral look because everything was coming together. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a confession. Linda had just given him all the ammo he needed, but she was unaware that the guy in front of her was the one from whom she had been stealing. Shaq was standing. He was standing still in front of Linda Hayes, staring at her as the words she had just spoken lingered in the air. Her abrupt change in attitude had caught him off guard. Shaq had seen a lot of people attempt to conceal their guilt behind bluster, but Linda's remarks weren't just defensive. They were aggressive. And for a brief period, the audience could tell that she knew more than she was admitting. Seemed to stop the store's background music's gentle hum, and the muted outside conversation died away. As Shaq processed all Linda had just spoken to him in front of him, his thoughts raced. A display of pricey jewelry, but her remarks weren't only the rebellious digressions of an unprepared person. They were what someone who felt besieged had to say, and when individuals feel cornered, they often expose more than they intended to. She had scoffed, and the rage in her voice was, "Is that all you came here for?" Noticeable anise from someone as refined as Linda that he hadn't anticipated. When she touched the rubies, her hands shook a little, but her face stayed as unyielding as stone. At that moment, Shaq recognized that the money she had been stealing wasn't only a matter of money. It was her behavior, and the manner she addressed him gave the impression that she had anything to demonstrate astonishment. Took a deep, calm breath, and felt the burden of the situation fall on his shoulders. Had anticipated this and even guessed it, but confronting the truth face to face was never easy, and now she had to face the reality of her guilt. Was indisputable that Linda was the perpetrator, not only a suspect. "I'm not sure what you're speaking about, Shaq," he said in a quiet, low voice that concealed the raging his head racing with ideas. "I'm only here to buy something." The strain Linda's nostrils flared as she scowled at him, the space between them thickening like an imperceptible barrier that neither could breach. The mask was falling off her eyes, which were filled with a mixture of dread and hate, and she realized she had erred. She wasn't prepared to lose everything, yet you think you can just stroll in here and I know what's been going on behind the scenes, Linda said, raising her voice in pitch. "Act like you're one of us. Your business is always operating in the shadows and doing business in secret. You are no better than the folks you declare to hate. Shaq's eyes hardened, since he has heard several accusations made against him. Despite being cold-blooded, cunning, and vicious throughout the years, he had never been charged with being a fraud, but not by someone who didn't know who he was. Linda's remarks were more profound than his would have liked to acknowledge, but he was unable to do so since he had work to do. Confrontation was just the beginning, he replied, his tone lowering. I'm not here to argue with you, Linda. Linda seemed to stop at the thought of carrying an edge, but I'm here for the truth now. Her lips slightly opened as if she were about to say anything more, but the weight of his words caused her body to stop for a second. However, as the walls closed in on her, she clamped them tight, her face hardening into a defiant grimace. Instead of displaying weakness, she stepped closer to Shaq, bringing her heels closer to his. You don't have any idea who I am, she said, clicking forcefully on the polished floor. You believe you're in charge, but you're unaware of the amount of power I've had in this. She spit out her venom-dripping voice. Business, you believe you can just come here and use your wealth and prestigious position to frighten me? You have no clue who you are dealing with, Shaq, who refused to back down and kept her gaze fixed on him. The lady who came before him wasn't only a robber, she was dangerous and a skilled manipulator, but Shaq had played this game long enough to understand how to deal with individuals. Like her, he had seen people and wasn't going to be scared by someone like Linda. Crack under strain in the past, and he was aware that the truth would always eventually come to light. Power is a delusion in and of itself, Shaq said calmly, his voice now bearing an warning undertone. And because you're not in charge at the moment, I'm Linda, letting out a loud tone that contrasted with the normally serene ambiance of the door. So you think you can simply walk? She scoffed, her eyes narrowing. We're all in shock at Linda's remarks, and you're just as imprisoned as I am, Shaq. Caught in his mind, causing him to wonder what she meant when she said that he had a suspicion. That although Linda's motivations went beyond simple avarice, this was novel since she was engaging in risky behavior. For a brief minute, Shaq pondered how far this web of corruption ran, but she wasn't scared of the consequences. He wondered whether Linda was acting alone or if she was a little part of something bigger. But now that he needed to have her make a mistake, he couldn't afford to be sidetracked. To expose her actual motivations, and he had the perfect thing to make her go over the edge. You're not in. You will be when the law catches up. But for now, Linda, Shaq reiterated his forceful voice. When you brought up the law, Linda's face momentarily wavered, a spark of terror appearing across her eyes before she calmed down, and Shaq saw it right away. Did you suppose I was afraid of the law because of that gap in her armor? Her once aggressive tone abruptly changed to one that was far more menacing. You think you can frighten me? Shaq moved closer to him as he suddenly said, You don't know me, loomed over her, yet he stayed out of reach. I don't have to frighten you, Linda. Silently, he said that the truth is sufficient, and that it has the power to bring people like Linda's breath caught in their throats, and Shaq briefly caught sight of her defiance. She hesitated, opening her lips to speak but then holding herself back. Shaq could see the struggle in her eyes as her shoulders drooped slightly, as if she were restless and battling her own inner problems. Wasn't prepared to concede just yet, but the game was becoming harder and harder. Linda, Shaq replied, Nearly up, you're done. Now, in a faint whisper, the law will come up with you, and don't assume you'll have a place to hide when it does. For the first time in their conversation, Shaq saw the terror in Linda's flickering eyes. It wasn't simply fear of losing her job or her reputation, it was something deeper, a dread of the repercussions of her actions. But as fast as it seemed, Linda shut herself off once again, her face hardening. I'll take my chances. Shaw's lips curved into a narrow line as she spoke in a tense, somewhat challenging voice. He switched on, and we'll see who wins this game in the end. Smile. You may run, but you can't hide forever, Linda. The truth was now out, and he turned on his heel and left Linda alone in the jewelry stores. Silence. And just as his wheels had started turning, Shaq was aware that this was far from finished, but he also understood that people like Linda eventually get what's coming to them. Big Shaq was struck by the chilly morning air as he stepped out of the jewelry shop was a stark contrast to the friendly encounter he had just left behind, and his heart was still racing. His mind was spinning with ideas about what had happened. He knew Linda Hayes was a problem, but he had never thought that she would attack him with such audacity and recklessness. It was as if she thought she had nothing to lose, as if the possibility of losing everything didn't matter to her. Shaq's vehicle was waiting for him across the street sliding into the rear seat as the door softly closed behind him. Marcus, his driver, was calm and collected and didn't inquire about anything, just turned on the car and drove as usual, but Shaw wasn't focused on. When Linda looked him in the eye and made it obvious in the shop, the road ahead was still on her. Knowing she had no intention of backing down, "Take me to the office," Shaw finally. The driver nodded and adjusted the rearview mirror as he spoke in a forceful yet quiet voice. The skyline of the city spread out in front of them. But for Big Shaq, the metropolis had always been only a setting for his actual profession. As they moved through the busy streets, his mind shifted to what would happen next. Had occurred. In the shop was the opening act, not a singular occurrence. Shaq had gained a lot of knowledge while immersed in a much bigger story, based on Linda's protective stance and the way she snapped at him. Her frantic effort to keep everything under control suggested something more serious. She wasn't acting alone. Couldn't be there since without assistance from a higher authority, Shaq, no one could have embezzled as much money as she had. Had always had a suspicion that certain people in the organization weren't really reliable, but Linda's actions had validated his darkest suspicions that there was far more corruption than simply her. Shaq's focus returned to the work at hand as the automobile pulled into the office building's subterranean parking garage. He had to act and stop Linda from escaping since he couldn't afford to allow her any more leeway. Move swiftly. Although the elevator journey to the top level was short, it provided Shaq after taking a minute to gather his thoughts, he purposefully went outside as soon as the elevator doors opened. As he looked around the building, the polished wood flooring and sleek glass walls of the corporate headquarters seemed impersonal. And far away from him today, this location that was once his territory suddenly seems to a stage for deceit, where layers of falsehoods were layered over the truth. Hal Truth's Shaw entered his private office without saying anything to his helper. As he walked in, Janet was already at her desk working on her computer, and she glanced up, but she murmured. She only knew how to ask questions since Shaq was a guy of few words and only spoke when he had something crucial to say. Talk about how everyone in the building knew to line up. "I need you to do a background check. Check on Linda Hayes," he urged in a firm but authoritative tone, but Janet didn't. Without hesitation, she focused on her computer and started typing frantically, saying, "I'll get it to you right away." Mr. Shaq nodded and started thinking about the next move, while Janet took a seat at his workstation, worked on the background check shock, and grabbed his phone to telephone a number from recall that the telephone rang many times before Shaq's stern voice was heard. "Jerry," Shaq said, sitting back in his chair. "What's up?" "Chair, please provide me with the names of all the leading partners and investors who are connected to the downtown location. If anybody is interested, I'll find out who Jerry is." Jerry was a longtime buddy, and he was a corporate espionage specialist who had spent years working with Shaq, gathering intelligence and researching the lives of individuals who pose a danger to the empire. He was skilled at what he did, and Shaq needed his knowledge more than ever at this moment. Shaw hung up the phone and sat there after Jerry responded, "Get on it," without hesitation. "You'll have the list by the end of the day." Observing the city below from the window, he was used to playing the long game since he had built his empire from the ground up, deal by deal, brick by brick. But now that Linda's treachery is hanging, he was aware that time was running out and that he couldn't afford to wait. And every second of doubt brought him. The following several hours flew by while Janet provided the backdrop, bringing us closer to the point of no return. Check up on Linda, but there wasn't anything new to report. Her record was clear and she had no criminal history. Shaq had gained enough knowledge over the years to see that sometimes the financial mishandling was almost too clean. The deepest secrets were concealed by the most perfect records. But for the time being, Linda's background wasn't Jerry's call. Shortly before noon was his primary worry, and her presence was what counted. "Arrived. I have the list," Jerry stated in a quiet voice. "You were right to be." After Shaq, I discovered a link between Linda and two of the company's biggest investors. For months, they have been transferring funds via the branch, and it seems that they have been conspiring to steal at the top of the scale. Shaq experienced a rush of fulfillment. However, it was tinged with rage. He had suspected it, but Linda had additional concerns after hearing it verified. Been collaborating with influential investors who have the power to shield her if she was falling, but she wasn't falling by herself. There was a whole network of Jerry. Shaq's voice remarked, "Good work, everyone involved in the scheme." Shaq was going to make sure they all paid for their role in it. "I need to act quickly as the hours passed, so please email me whatever you have, Steely." Shaq's plan started to come together. He would go up to Linda once again, but this time, he wouldn't be alone, himself. Instead, he would have the law on his side, and he would possess the proof necessary to bring Linda and everyone else who had participated in the web, was becoming tighter in the EMZ, and the trap was about to be released. Yet even as he was ready to move on, something kept bugging him in the back of his mind. Linda's. The store's response had been more than simply fear or rage. It had been Shaq was aware that the most deadly thing of all was desperation. As he collected the last bits, it was impossible to predict how far she would go to defend herself. Of the problem, Big Shaq was certain that this would not be simple, and that it would need everything. He had to hold the guilty parties accountable, but he had never given up a battle, and this would be no exception. Different. The game had already started, and the sun could not be turned back this time. By the time Big Shaq left his office, the city, with its never-ending lights and commotion, had gone below the horizon, seemed removed from the whirlwind of ideas racing through his head, and Linda Hayes had no clue what was about to happen. She had spun a web of depravity that was about to come undone, and it would not be long until she and her cohorts would be held responsible. Shaq's phone rang in his pocket as he made his way to his vehicle. Grabbed it, looking over Jerry's message. "Everything is in place. I've scheduled a meeting for tomorrow with the investors you believed are there, so tighten your hold on the phone." As everything came together, Jerry had set up a trap for the investors who Shaq had everything he needed to bring, and they were now involved in the plot after laundering money via Linda's branch. It all down. But Shaq was aware that he couldn't let his feelings to influence his decision-making in spite of the growing facts. Let the rage that was building inside of him to influence his behavior. Instead, he needed to be cool, patient, and strategic with his adversaries. They could even be referred to be dangerous, influential, and powerful. The next day, however, dawned dreary and chilly, but that didn't matter since Shaq would see that the law took its course. The city, which was earlier bustling with activity, seemed to be calmer now that the clouds were low in the sky. Shaq believed that he was standing in front of his penthouse's mirrored windows, with his reflection looking back at him. Always been a guy who liked to behave in quiet and without being observed, yet he had to face the people who had endangered all he had constructed today, so he put on a suit as sharp as the edge of his phone buzzed once more as his thoughts went blank, with a commanding presence. Reminder that Jerry had scheduled a meeting with the investors. Shaq was unsure of what to anticipate, but he was certain of one thing. This would be the pivotal moment. That was when everything would either come together or break apart. He sensed the anxiety in the air as he walked into the boardroom, which was in disarray, spacious with high-back seats around a huge glass table in the middle. Looked sophisticated but antiseptic, much like the calculating coldness of the men seated around the table, each of whom played a crucial role in. There were 4 elements in the game, each of which was a component of the dishonest system that had been destroying the business from inside. Shaq recognized the faces of the individuals around the table from the company's reports, whose identities were connected to the secrets, funds, and investments. All of them had years of business experience and were older than Shaq, but none of them knew him. None of them were aware of the true identity of Big Shaq. They were unaware of the guy behind the as Shaq took his seat. The man controlling the cords pulled the curtain, and the room went quiet. The men exchanged cautious. It was obvious from the looks assessing him that those were unpleasant shocks. Even though they were unfamiliar with the guy in front of them, his reputation preceded him, and his very presence was sufficient to make anybody nervous. "We're here to talk about some serious issues," he said. "Issues that are straightforward yet solid and have persisted for a long time." Shaq could sense the men's uneasiness as they gazed at one another for a long time without saying anything, attempting to seem as if they were unaware of what was about to happen. But Shaq was aware of this and understood the precise reason why they, "Are you here?" "I am aware of the financial shock," he added, his voice piercing the silence like a knife. "I am aware of the money laundering and smuggling via Linda Hayes' section, and I am aware that you have participated in it." One of the males is a tall, slender man. He moved uneasily in his seat, his graying hair in a crisp suit, and he opened his lips to speak, but it was cut. Shaq's penetrating glance might make you want to deny it. Continues. "But I've been watching for months, and I have the evidence, so do you. I've seen every transaction, every mistake you made, and you believed you could get away with it. But the guy changed." Leaning forward once again in an attempt to exert some control, You cannot just accuse us of "I have no evidence that he said it." His voice tinted with worry. "Have more than enough evidence." Shaq cut in icily, his eyes narrowing. "I have witnesses, transactions, and records." "Who saw it all?" "You're not as untouchable as you believe." The atmosphere in the room was high. The other guys at the table were becoming clearly uncomfortable, and Shaq he had been waiting for this moment, and he could almost taste the anxiety that was starting to permeate their voices, anticipating the moment when they would fully understand how much they had misjudged him. They understood they were besieged, even if they had believed they were unbeatable. Shaq stated in a cool but chilly tone, "You've been playing a hazardous game, and now it was evident that the guys were comprehending, since they were quiet. Now and their faces were pallid. One by one they started to crumble under the strain of what was occurring, their tough exteriors disintegrating. Finally, the thin man who had been speaking broke the stillness. "What do you think?" Shaq sat back in his chair, crossing his arms, and inquired in a shaky voice what he wanted from us. "Want justice? I want you to acknowledge your wrongdoing, and I want to make sure that everyone engaged in this catastrophe has responsibility for their acts, beginning with you." The guy firmly swallowed his eyes. "I understand, but you're running around the room and you don't get it? You thought you could keep your hands clean, you thought you could," Shaq continued, interrupting him again. "It's your chance to confront the truth, even if you fill your pockets and escape unharmed." Repercussions. Another man, a thick-necked, stocky man, rose up, his hands clenched at his sides. "You can't simply tell me who you're dealing with because," he growled. Shaq said, "Who am I dealing with?" in a calm but unquestionably powerful voice. "You don't scare me." For the first time, the guys seemed really terrified as the room fell hushed once again under the weight of Shaq's remarks. They were obviously underestimating him, and now they had to deal with the fallout from their deeds. Shaw's thoughts raced when he saw that dynamic shift had taken over, and Shaq kept his gaze fixed on the men's faces. "But I'll be making sure the authorities are informed. Also prepared to offer you one last opportunity to confess if you cooperate and admit to. I can ensure that the penalty is less severe for what you did. But if you decide to continue fighting me, I won't think twice about using the entire power of the law to silence you." Deafening Shaq knew he had them in the corner of the room, and they were the only ones who knew it. The last issue was whether they would accept their destiny and deal with the shock of the end or fight to the very end. Firmly believed that this was only the start of the fight, and he wasn't going to stop until everyone who had harmed him and his business had to pay for their. The boardroom's air had thickened due to treachery, and each shock made the guys surrounding it feel heavier than before. Table were obviously perspiring, and their once assured positions had slouched into defecation. For a long time nobody said. Shaq could only hear the slight buzz of the lights above him, and he could feel the weight he could feel the power change as the room settled over him like a blanket. Men who had previously played their games from the shadows and felt untouchable suddenly had to deal with the relentless cold. The thin, graying man who had attempted to act with the light of truth. His voice tightened. Bravado shuffled in his chair. "What do you want from us, Shaq?" he inquired. But it was obvious that his tone had changed from one of power to weakness. He sounded vulnerable with a crack in his voice. "We're just business people." Shaq's lips twisted into a little icy grin as he tried to earn a life like everyone else. "You may have been business people, but now you're just criminals, and the only money you've been earning is from lying." And the other guys looked about in an attempt to assess the situation, maybe seeking a means of escape. But Shaq was the only one in control, and he wasn't going to let them to go without. There was no way out of the repercussions. They had attempted to ruin him, and now wasn't it time for them to pay? The stocky guy with the thick, his cheeks flushed with rage as his neck interposed. "This was more than just us. You believe that Linda is the only one responsible for this. You have no." Shaw's eyes widened as he realized what he was up against. He had expected this last-ditch effort to deflect in order to give the impression that they were pawns in a game that was being directed by someone else, but Shaq wasn't duped. Had been aware from the start that Linda was just the beginning. Something had motivated her actions. More profound, something much more hazardous, and who is controlling it? Who is the mastermind behind everything in this room? Shaq questioned in a quiet, controlled voice. Went silent once again. The stocky man's lips quivered, but he refused to budge. The thin man then said, "You won't get anything from us because of." His trembling voice. "You have no clue who you're working with, but they have connections with strong individuals who will ensure that this all disappears. You're a little fish in a vast pond when you're with Shaq." Shaq leaned forward, his eyes. "I'm not interested in threats, guys," he said, narrowing as he examined each one, said in a calm but weighty voice that stifled any further protests. "I've been in this game long enough to. You're curious about who I'm interacting with, and I'm dealing with males. I've seen it all before. People like you who believe they can conceal their money and power inevitably end up." The stocky man's hands were squeezed into fists, but he remained silent. He took out a stack of papers instead of giving them the luxury of watching him flinch. Each document was a damaging piece of evidence that was taken out of his briefcase and laid down on the table in front of them. Internal communications, transaction, records, and financial statements all plainly linked to their participation in the embezzlement plot. The case was painstakingly constructed, leaving little opportunity for. Shaq said that his voice is as sharp as a dagger, and that these are just the beginning. The authorities will be aware of everything you've done, including transactions and deals, and when they arrive, there won't be anybody to keep you safe. The guys looked at each other in fear. However, the thin man's voice was shaking when he finally spoke. "And you have no idea what you're causing difficulties for yourself, Shaq. And you believe you've won. Can ruin you as easily as you believe you can ruin us," Shaq said, his eyes darkened. "I've been through worse," he replied. "Firmly, and I'll make sure that everyone is held accountable for their actions. Not even you." The thin man seemed to want to respond, but it appeared that the words of astonishment had broken his determination. The stocky sagged back in his chair with his shoulders bowed in despair. Even though the guy was still furious, he could tell that they had lost. The last guy, the calmest of them all, said, "Enough." He had been silent up until this point, but his patience had. His face was crisp and his suit was well made, but his voice trembled in desperation. "You can't do this, Shaq," he said. "Crossing us is something you'll regret." Shaq looked into his eyes, and for a brief period the room was dead silent, and the quiet was almost oppressive. Shaq had heard similar threats before and had dealt with folks like these for a long time, so he wasn't scared. "Years I'm not crossing you," Shaq quietly answered. "I'm ending this, and I'll be there to make sure you deal with any legal action that comes your way." As a result of your actions, the chamber became quiet again, and the guys realized they were stuck. No option but to concede defeat, since Shaq's actions, not simply the facts, were what had ultimately determined their destiny. Something they didn't use. Instead, they assumed that their riches and influence would be sufficient to undervalue him, might protect them from responsibility, but they realized The reality shock was untouchable. "I advise you to begin making plans," Shaq replied, getting up from his chair. "The authorities will be here shortly." Shaq moved away from the guys, saying, "Enough, you don't have much time." Stayed still, their eyes wide with terror that the roles had been reversed and they had already completed their game, so there was no way out. But now it was time for them to facing the repercussions. Shaq left the room with measured steps and a composed demeanor. Wasn't over yet. But he felt the weight for the first time in a long time. Removed the burden off his shoulders. He had taken action, and now the world would realize that Big Shaq was no longer only a moniker in the background. He was the one who had been controlling everything all along. The reckoning, and he was staying put. The days that followed the boardroom discussion where a haze of Big Shaq had made his move, and there was a sense of tension, expectancy, and slow building dread. The wheels of justice were now slowly turning. The authorities had been informed, and Shaw's carefully. Those in charge of making sure the law caught up with Linda Hayes in the prepared case were now in charge of corrupt investors who believed they could conceal their income and have an impact on the city's continued bustle seemed to be ignorant. Shaq was ready to be broken by the storm, but he knew better since he had seen such events before. When the reality hit, he saw the crooks, bluster break before the stillness before the pandemonium. Them, and now Shaq was going to see that very thing happen. He sat in the penthouse office, gazed out of the expansive windows framing the city below, which glistened in the noon sun. However, shock seemed far away, even chilly. He had always been a guy who flourished in the shadows and stayed out of the limelight. But now that the consequences of his choices were bearing down on him, he wasn't only playing for. He had spent decades building the phone on his desk, but now he was playing for the empire's future rather than himself. Jolted him out of his reverie, and he looked at the caller ID and saw that it was Jerry. Shaq had been anticipating this call, and Jerry had been putting in a lot of overtime behind the scenes to pull the, if anybody knew the pulse, strings were collecting data and ensuring that everything was prepared for the final takedown. When Jerry Shaq answered the phone, he stated that it was Jerry Shaq. Jerry's voice was calm, yet eager, and there was a glimmer of excitement in the authorities have started their investigation. The investors have been subpoenaed, and we have. His face was inscrutable as they were encircled, and the walls were closing in astonishment. But he sensed a little spark of fulfillment action. The jigsaw pieces were at last coming together, and those who had believed they escape, who had thought they were untouchable, were now having to deal with the fallout from their Shaq questioned. His mind, how long until the arrest? His thoughts were already racing. Considering his next course of action, Jerry hesitated for a second before answering shortly after investigators have already arrived at the downtown branch, where Linda, Hayes and the other investors are currently being questioned. They don't know how much we have on them, but they're already anxious and panicking because they believe they can. They can talk their way out of it, but eventually they'll break. Shaq nodded, his hands tightening on the phone. Make sure everything is in place before they go down. I want it to be fast. I don't want anybody getting any notions regarding escape. Jerry's voice was forceful in answer. Realized, I've already set up the press conference. We'll control the narrative when the arrests come. The media will be ready to convey the story. There's no going back. Now Shaq's eyes widened as he heard the last bit of the idea was taking shape. He had always understood that he would have to steer the story. There couldn't be any space for uncertainty or perplexity if the public thought these guys were innocent, or if any uncertainty persisted, it would undercut. He couldn't let me be there soon because of all Shay had fought for, Shaq remarked in a hushed but determined voice. I want to personally supervise the procedure to ensure that everything proceeds as planned. With that, he hung up and rose from his desk, his steps deliberate and deliberate. The moment for nuance having passed, it was time to wrap things up, and Shaq departed his penthouse. Once again, the weight of the situation descended over him. It had been a protracted process involving meticulous preparation and execution, but now he was going to see everything come to pass, including Linda, the unscrupulous investors. Authorities said that everyone involved in the plan was going to pay a price, and Shaq wasn't going to offer them the opportunity to evade detection. The trip to the downtown branch was peaceful, with the city's streets passing by in a blur. Outside his car's tinted windows, Shaw's attention was on the mission at hand. He was known for protecting a heritage to preserve, and he was now set to solidify his position in the annals of his firm. This wasn't just about punishing, it was about sending a message. It was about showing everyone that Huge Shaq was a guy of integrity, a man who wouldn't allow corruption contaminate what he had achieved when Shaq came at the downtown branch. He was welcomed with a bustle of action. The police vehicles lined the street, their bright lights reflecting off the buildings. Glass walls, the investigators' anxious mood was electric, were already actively searching through documents and interrogating staff members. Linda Hayes was detained and seated her face was drawn and pale in the little windowless room, and Shaq couldn't help but feel a brief moment of gratification at seeing the lady who believed she could control the system. She was able to outwit him as he passed the busy scene with steady. The investors, who had participated in the scam, were there as he walked measuredly to the rear offices. As they waited for their destiny, sitting on uncomfortable seats with twitchy hands, shock penetrated that his presence was sufficient to silence the room, and the men turned to face him, their faces displaying a mixture of. Shaq remarked in a low voice, "Fear and dispel. You didn't think it would come to this, did you? You believed you could get away with carrying an unquestionable force. Assumed you would be protected by your riches and influence, but one of the men, the slender one with graying hair, was mistaken." Moved uneasily in his chair, raising his mouth to comment, but Shaq interrupted him with a look that said, "You have no." Shaq firmly said, "Your time is up. The law's in control. More power here." Now, as the truth set in, the guys sat in startled stillness, their faces pallid. Shaq was aware that they were already weighing their alternatives in an attempt to find a way to avoid the inevitable, but there was no way out. They were already surrounded by the media van's bright lights, which were visible through the reporters were already gathering in front of the enormous windows in preparation for the public announcement, and she was aware that when the truth came out, everyone would realize how crooked his organization had become, and there would be no going back. Shaq said in a stern and decisive tone, "I'll make sure the press knows exactly who's responsible for this when I return. When the news spreads, you won't have somewhere to hide." Shaq tried to go, but he was unable to help but feel as if the burden of his choices is now being lifted. He had battled for this moment in order to preserve his integrity. Of his crew battled to prosecute the culprits, and now that the storm had passed, the reckoning was come. The days that followed seemed to drag on forever for Big Shaq, as the city was ablaze with rumors of scandal as the media frenzy played out. The arrests of Linda Hayes and his company's investors were being covered by the media. Shaw's name was once muttered in the depravity that was exposed for the world to see. Whispered in private conversations was now a story that wasn't only about a rich and enigmatic, yet a man who has destroyed an empire of thieves whose strategic actions had revealed an extensive crooked network. Shaq had always been a guy who worked in the shadows, cautious to keep everything under control without ever entering the light. But now that the storm had started, had started to. The world was finally paying attention as it reached its zenith. The boardroom had been a shack and Battleground had won, but it seemed like a hollow triumph. In the back of his mind hung the burden of the choices he had made about the individuals he had been compelled to reveal. He had risked everything, even his own sense of integrity and the empire he had spent decades creating. Shaq was battling not just for financial gain, but also for the core principles of his business, which he established when he started by saying that the arrest's aftermath was both a win and a sadly. The investors who had controlled the company's fortune had been accused with conspiracy, fraud, and money laundering. Once mud was now engraved in the upper strata of society, and Linda Hayes had also been. She was once the ambitious and self-assured deputy director, but after being found guilty of a crime, she lost both her job and her. They had been brought to their knees by dignity shock. But the triumph came with a sour aftertaste. Janet, his devoted aide, snapped him out of his reverie with the sound of his office door opening, entered with a pile of papers in her hands, and Shaq tried to hide the exhaustion that had started to. He had not slept since the day of the arrests, so he needed time to calm down. Mr. Shaq Janet's tone. The media is excited for your news conference tomorrow, so she put the documents on his desk with caution. Shaq rubbed the bridge of his nose and groaned, saying, I know I've been hearing about it often. It's a great chance for you, she said, closely observing his response. The world is eager to hear your thoughts. Shah leaned back. The papers Janet had put in front of him, his chair, and his gaze. The media was indeed eager, and the scandal was one of the Shaq was at the heart of the largest business betrayals in recent memory. But in reality, he wasn't willing to talk about what was he left to claim that he had taken the required precautions to safeguard his business and maintain its integrity. But in the wake of what transpired, the truth was starting to set in that there was no going back since he had taken quick and decisive action, yet even the weight of justice had its repercussions, and his connections with former co-workers and business associates had been damaged, and his city was no longer the refuge it had been. His triumph came at a greater cost, more than he had expected, but maybe it was the cost of taking charge of what was required to protect the future. And I'll be prepared for the press conference, Shaq stated after a lengthy silence. Level-headed but with a hint of resignation, let them know that I completed the necessary task. Janet nodded. I'll make the Shaq's eyes lingered on the pile of papers she had set in front of him as she turned to go. Press announcements, financial records, and reports are all components of the plan to keep the narrative under control. The media would fabricate tales, but Shaq understood the importance of the truth. The facts were indisputable that night when Shaq walked, regardless of what the world may think. The lights above him flashed along the deserted hallways of his office building, creating long shadows on the glossy stories. The bustle of the city outside was subdued and everything seemed strange. If everyone was holding their breath in anticipation of something that was waiting for him, he reached the rooftop, his favorite spot to look out over the city below. The cityscape ablaze with light. Shaq stood on the rooftop's edge, gazing out over the expansive metropolis which had completely circled the rise and fall of persons in positions of authority, the devotion of his supporters, and the betrayal that had almost destroyed everything. Shaq closed his eyes for a while, letting the cold air flow through his hair. Around him, he reflected about the individuals who had trusted him, the staff members who had supported his goal, considered the legacy he had created, which went beyond material prosperity and opulence to include something more profound: honesty, accountability, and leadership. Shaq was aware that everyone was watching as the press conference approached. This was his opportunity to establish his name and prove to the world his abilities. But more significantly, it was his opportunity to regain authority over both the business and his personal story. The news conference was scheduled on the following day, and as the unsettling hours passed, he readied himself for the impending onslaught of the questions, the conjecture, scrutiny, and everything else would hit him with a power he had never experienced before. But he was prepared, for the maelstrom that his actions had caused would be strengthened, and he would remain steadfast in the conference the next day. Shaq appeared before the above him. Reporters fought for attention with their cameras blazing and microphones and spotlights harsh. Shaq's eyes scanned the room, taking in the sea of faces, yet he stayed composed since he had encountered hardship once, and he would encounter it once again. The inquiries started to come in fast succession. A reporter asked, "What does this mean for your company, Shaq?" in reference to the latest arrests. "How do you feel, Mr. Shaq?" was steadfast and unflinching. "The truth has arrived, joy has arrived, and those who did it will pay the price. Integrity is the foundation of my business, and I will stop at nothing to safeguard it. What transpired was intolerable, and I won't let it go on." Another reporter held up their hand. "Does this mean the scandal is over?" Shaq's face stiffened. Little, but he didn't flinch. "Is there more to come? The law will make sure that those responsible get justice, but this is just the first step. Rebuilding trust is essential, and we'll face the questions head-on." Persisted, but Shaq was calm and methodical with every phrase. The media was desperate for answers, but Shaq had given them nothing to mislead them. He had given them the information. They needed to hear the truth. He would take care of the rest. In his own time, Shaq left the platform as the conference came to an end, his heart still racing. The world would still be watching, and the consequences of the scandal would continue to reverberate every aspect of his life. But for the time being, Shaq was certain that he had endured the worst of it, and he would never give up, regardless of what came next. Even if the press conference went well, Big Shaq couldn't get rid of the impression that the most difficult aspect of this experience was still in front of him. The cameras and flashes. The reporters' questions had been addressed and the lights had come and gone, but the consequences of his choices were far from over. His business, his staff, and even his own self-esteem had been disturbed by the scandal that shook the Diamond Empire to its foundation as Shaq passed through his office's corridors. Building's typical bustle seemed to be less intense than it had been before his staff. They seemed to avoid looking at him, their whispers reverberating, after formerly being so ready to welcome him with respect and enthusiasm. There was no doubting it in the hallways, even while the legal fights were won. The cultural and psychological cost of Shaq had never been one to concentrate on public opinion. Instead, he had established his empire via perseverance, determination, and a resolute sense of purpose. But now even he was unable to ignore the fact that his colleagues' loyalty and the trust he had fought so hard to establish had been destroyed, was no longer a given from his customers. He went inside his office, the door clicking, closed with a finality that reverberated throughout the room's silence, and the skyline beyond his window was engulfed in. Despite the stunning perspective, the city sprawled out below him like a painting in the mellow light of the setting sun. The price of victory that Shaq had learned had left him feeling alone, and he was unable to get rid of it, was evaluated not just in monetary terms, but also in the connections you had to give up. Mr. Shaq, Janet's voice cut through the moral concessions you were had to make and the trust you had to betray. Stillness as she walked into his office holding a new set of paperwork, pausing briefly to take in the grim look on his face. I have the most recent information on the investigations, and everything seems to be proceeding according to plan. Shaq questioned, his face hard as stones about the public's response. He didn't want to hear that, but he had to get to know Janet well. Went back and laid the reports on his desk. They're mixed, she murmured slowly. Some of them are thanking you for acting quickly to expose the misconduct, but others, particularly those who are connected to the investors, are demanding an investigation into your role in the matter, asking if you were aware of the embezzlement before all became clear. Shaw's jaw tightened as the charges were he had anticipated, but not less enraged, that removing the top executives from his own company would encourage examination of not just their behavior, but also his own. The public didn't always comprehend the complexities of business choices, but they were unaware of the costs associated with his actions, made the terrible but essential choice to reveal those he had previously trusted. But I did what had to be done, Shaq, even if it had come at a high personal cost. He got up from his desk and paced the room, muttering more to himself than to Janet as the weight. Despite the circumstances that were forced upon him, the integrity of the truth is more essential than popular opinion. Firm, the most important thing is to safeguard the employees. As someone who believes in what we've created, Janet nodded with a sympathetic look. However, realistically, the staff members' sentiments are also split. Some are appreciative, others are unsure, and many are terrified of what lies ahead for us. Shaq, one of our customers, stopped pacing and turned to face her once we lost trust. We'll rebuild, he answered confidently, his eyes steely with resolve. We always rebuild. We've already done it and we'll do it once again, but this time it will be. Janet remained quiet for a while before speaking, but I'll make sure of it. Even if you've always been in charge, Mr. Shaq, there's only so much you can do. This scandal is beyond your company's control. The media is already. As they go farther and discover hints of political ties, individuals are beginning to pose inquiries that go beyond. Shaw's brows furrowed in the boardroom. He knew his adversaries wouldn't go subtly, but this battle was more than simply a struggle for his company's survival. It was turning into a conflict over his image and his position in the world. People were already beginning to wonder whether his ascent to power had been legal. People were wondering if he approached his desk and stared at it, demonstrating that he was as tidy as he had claimed to be. "What precisely are the reports in front of him saying?" he asked, his voice. Janet was hesitant to respond, saying, "There are reports that you were long before the inquiry started. Several people were aware of the financial disparities. Let's imagine you ignored it since it helped you. But others are saying that Shaq clenched his fists, the falsehoods, the rumors. You're not as pure as you want people to believe." A portion of the game, which he had been playing for years and which had led him to this point, was the media would constantly fabricate their own tales. It was their responsibility to construct a story, and it was his responsibility to keep the truth under control. "I've worked in this field long enough to understand that individuals will always," he said in a tight, restrained voice. "But the truth will eventually out, and I won't allow anybody to change my people who are important to me, such as my customers and workers, are aware of who I am. They understand what I stand for." Janet nodded, but her expression remained worried. "What about the investors? Do you have a strategy for those who were arrested?" Shaq inhaled deeply before moving to the window and looking out. He responded, "The law will take care of them," moving toward the horizon. "Be tried, found guilty, and punished for their actions. But they are just the first step this business and this empire need. A new vision I intend to start again by cleaning the home. And I won't stop until I reach this location, is really mine once again." And there was a hush between them that was heavy with the weight of, according to his statements, Shaq has always been a confident, precise individual. Although he was aware that the journey ahead would be lengthy, challenging, and unpredictable, the firm was his lifeblood. Rebuilding it would need more than simply legal action since it had been damaged. A change in culture, a reimagining of the company's values. "We're going to do this right," Shaq said in a resolute tone. "We will repair not just the company, but also the damaged trust and emerge stronger." As the door clicked shut behind Janet Shaq, I stood there because of what I had spoken. When he was alone himself in his office, the words he had said hung thick in the air outside the city, still alive, with its turbulent energy that was oblivious to the tempest that had just swept over high society. But the struggle was for Big Shaq. Was far from done. This was only the beginning, and he would rebuild and regain whatever it required. All that he had lost, and the weeks that followed the press conference were filled with a lot of legal disputes and media coverage. The company, of scrutiny and extreme pressure shock, had turned into a lightning rod for both praise and condemnation. Many praised him for his bold steps in exposing corruption, seeing him as a champion of integrity. But the rumors and accusations continued to cast a dark cloud of doubt over his head. It had damaged his image. Whenever Shaq appeared in public, he felt the pressure of criticism from the media. Had a method of analyzing every action he took, challenging his intentions and exposing weaknesses in his public persona, was a never-ending struggle that he had already waged several times. Yet it seemed different this time since he knew his adversaries would fight back. Yet he hadn't anticipated the intensity with which they carried out their covert whispers about his role in the scandal, kept circulating. Some rogue investors, in a desperate attempt to save their reputation, were now attempting to discredit Shah by bringing up allegations of his possible involvement in order to get his name up in the dirt, in an attempt to distract from their own guilt. But what was worse was how alone Shaq had been. Throughout his career, he has surrounded himself with walls to defend his heart and his empire. However, the individuals who had previously worked with him and been his closest confidants suddenly seemed more like prisoners inside those walls. Were starting to doubt him, with some even speculating that he was more aware of the financial disparities than he had trusted the one thing he had always placed the most importance on. Since everything else was suddenly scarce, Shaq had always taken great satisfaction in his ability to remain focused and keep control of any circumstance. But suddenly he was doubting all he had previously fought so hard to establish. Unshakable had started to wane and was replaced with a persistent feeling of doubt. It was late one night when Shaq was sitting by himself in his office, gazing out at the city below. The skyscraper's lights glowed like far-off stars, yet they seemed chilly to him. He had just gotten a call from someone who was reminding him of all that was slipping through his fingertips. Jerry, his dependable ally, had always been the one to guide him through the murky waters of business. Politically, Jerry had told him that additional accusations were being made. Rumors of dubious backroom transactions and dubious political ties were beginning to circulate. Shaq was aware that there were more than a few rogue investors involved, but the extent of the "even he" was starting to be shocked by the plot. There were powerful individuals who had those who had a stake in keeping the facts hidden and would do everything to see him fail. Shea reclined in his chair. His empire was collapsing due to the situation's heavy weight, and he was unable to stop it, for he felt powerless over every choice he had made for the first time in a long time. His empire, which he had constructed from the ground up, was now being questioned for every step he had made with precision. Ground up was ready to crumble. He remembered the lady named Linda Hayes. Her stubborn visage plagued him as the one who had initiated this whole series of events. Given how nonchalantly she had insulted him at the jewelry shop, he had anticipated, feeling angry, even rather than feeling satisfied. He experienced a strong sense of betrayal since she was the one she had forced him to make the most difficult choice of his life. But Shaq saw that she had betrayed him even at that moment. She did him a favor that made him face the corruption at the core of his business, and the phone on his desk buzzed now that the rot was starting to spread. Shaq took it up, his palm still quivering a little from the weight of the discussion, breaking off his thoughts. Mr. Shaq, who had just spoken with Jerry, remarked calmly on the Janet is on the other end, and someone is waiting to greet you. A representative from Shaq snapped his attention back to the present and sent the legal team in. A little while later, the man's office door creaked open, and a tall, well-dressed lawyer entered. Was in his mid-40s, and his expression was calculating and incisive, as if he had seen it all. Kurt nodded, and then Mr. Shaq, the attorney, sat down across from him. We have been discussing the problem with the investors I have been in touch with in a low-key and professional manner. Shaq leaned forward at a number of gatherings, and I have some alarming news. My thoughts are already racing over the kind of news that caused the lawyer to pause for a second before speaking. A class action lawsuit is being discussed, and some of your present and former colleagues are starting to assert that you had a much longer awareness of the financial issues than you acknowledged, that they're claiming you ignored it, since it helped. Even if the charges weren't new, hearing them, spoken out loud, made you feel as though the blood was draining from his face. He had anticipated that the investors would strike out to defend themselves, but this assurance was a shock. But not his own staff members, who had been his co-workers for years and had put their faith in him. Now he took a long breath to regain his composure as they questioned his integrity. Are they, says he inquired in a harsh voice, but the lawyer's expression remained neutral. Although it's difficult to determine at this time, the accusations are becoming more widespread. Therefore, we must be ready for the worst. We must demonstrate to the public and the authorities that what you did was not only required, but carried out with the company's best interests in mind. Shaq tightened his fists under the weight of He had always understood that his choices would have an impact, but he felt the weight of the situation weigh much more heavily on his chest. Hadn't foreseen this, his own people, whom he had defended, were now betraying him. The foundation of his kingdom, which was founded on trust, loyalty, and the whispers of betrayal, were threatening my hard work. So I followed Shaq's advice. I clenched my teeth and did what I had to do to safeguard this company. The attorney nodded, but no consoling words or smile were heard. He just put a folder on the desk and leaned forward, saying, I'll start getting ready for your defense. However, Mr. Shaq, the next months will be very important. You must choose where you concentrate, whether it's on defending your freedom or repairing your reputation. Shaq examined the folder, his heart breaking. He had experienced hardships in the past, but nothing compared to this. His decades-long empire was collapsing under him, and the conflict was now more than simply an economic one. Shaq was in the middle of the storm, which was about survival, bearing the burden of, for the first time in his life, the world was bearing down on him, and he had no idea what the next day would bring. His empire was in a battle, and he wasn't sure whether he could win it or if it would swallow him completely. Rumors about his participation in the scandal and jeopardy the whispers appeared to get louder every hour. The weeks after the legal team's warning were filled with lengthy meetings and paperwork. Every day brought with it fresh difficulties, litigation, and accusations from previous workers' fresh efforts to challenge his authority, which the media was previously quick to commend him for eliminating the dishonest investors, now seemed to take pleasure in destroying him at every turn. The press examined and distorted every word he spoke. Yet in spite of the Shaq remained determined despite the commotion all around him. He had always been a guy of action, and this time would be no different. Different. He had worked too hard and accumulated too much to let it all to go. Had before encountered hardship, but this time it wasn't simply a business conflict. It was a conflict over his identity, legacy, and where in the world was Shaq sitting in his office, staring at the financial records strewn all over his desk, media pieces, legal briefs, and reports all blended into one massive jumble that was the impending class. He was aware that the action case against him was the last straw, and that if he couldn't figure out a way to salvage the situation, it would be the conclusion of what he had done for the people who accepted the charges. They were beginning to question all of his choices and motivations, but Shaq wasn't going to back down. His office door creaked open and Janet entered, her face tight and pallid. Despite being his rock throughout the whole event, she was unable to conceal her weariness. She started by saying, "Mr. Shaq, the strain of the scandal had affected them all." Speaking quietly but steadily, "I just received information from the legal team that the investors had engaged a prominent lawyer. They will fight this with all of their might. It will be a protracted struggle." Shaq gazed up at his stern, unflinching face. "I knew they would fight you dirty, but I won't allow it. Demolish what we've created. I won't give up easily." Janet nodded, but her expression was unsure. "You must be ready. The press is already reporting on your lawyer's claims, and they're demanding a thorough probe into your today. People are beginning to think that this was a systemic issue rather than simply a few poor actors." Of corruption, Shaw reclined in his chair, the facts whirling in his head. He had always anticipated this because his adversaries were strong and had the means to ruin his life. It was awful to set the world against him, but they had nothing at all that fact. "They may attempt to rewrite it any way they want," Shaq said in a hushed but determined voice, "but they are unable to accept the fact that they are unaware of what I have done to safeguard our business." Janet thoroughly examined him and asked me what the strategy was. Shaw's eyes narrowed as he felt the fury building within of him. "I've always believed in going public will be the first step in my long-term strategy, which I have already done and will do again. Make sure everyone knows the truth. I'll take over the story for good." Janet's eyes widened in horror. "You're certain that the media has been against you for weeks and will destroy you?" Shaq stood up. His stance was solid, and his voice was firm, unwavering. "I'm going to stop hiding and talk to the staff and other important individuals directly. I've been silent for too long, letting the public and stockholders tell the tale, but now I'm going to." He approached the window overlooking the city skyline and told me mine. The skyscrapers above him appeared to mock him, unconcerned with the conflict he was in. But Shaq wasn't going to let it to scare him. This city had served as his playground for many years, and he had created his empire out of nothing. Was determined to battle for what I've earned and wasn't going to let a few shady tactics take it all away. "I'm going to build," he murmured to himself more than to Janet. Shaq stood in front of the horizon that night as the sun sank below it. The world would be like cameras, the weight of the moment weighing on him like a physical force. The media had been waiting for him to step out and confront the accusations in order to protect him, but this was his last stand. His behavior, but Shaq refused to provide them with what they had anticipated. He would neither deliver an apology or excuses. The news conference was about to start, and Shaq took the stage. Felt like everyone was watching him. The cameras were trained on him, and the reporters were prepared to. For the first time, he felt vulnerable, but not in a manner that was vulnerable. Manner that gave him a greater sense of authority than ever before. Now was his chance to regain authority to share his perspective. "Ladies and gentlemen," he started, "as I come before you now, not as a man accused, in a firm and authoritative voice. However, as a guy who has always stood up for what is right. I have dedicated my whole life to creating this business and anything I could take pride in. And yes, I did make the tough choice to reveal corruption in my own company. It was a difficult decision, but it was the correct one. It was quiet and the reporters were listening intently to what I said. I know there are questions, however. I am here to tell you that I did, even though I am aware that there are doubts. What I did since it was required of the individuals accused of these offenses, Linda Hayes. The investors violated the core principles upon which this business was established, and I would not tolerate corruption destroying the things we have fought so hard to achieve. He stopped, allowing the weight of after he finishes speaking. Everyone in the room will say anything they want, and the media will fabricate their own tales. And I stand here with the truth I battled for this firm for despite my opponent's attempts to ruin me. I will not allow anybody to alter its future or that of its employees. Shaq understood what was about to happen since everyone was still watching him in the press room. Days would be difficult, but at that very moment, he sensed a change in himself. It was no longer just about defending his empire, it was about establishing his identity and standing firm against those who sought to bring him down, and he had no intention of retreating.